Hey, Kevin Symonds here, author of the book Pope Leo XIII and the Prayer to St. Michael. In honor of the new Holy Father, Leo XIV, I'd like to talk a little bit about his predecessor, Leo XIII, and a famous vision that he is said to had. I'm joined by Paul Ciaccia and Dr. Christopher Carr of Misericordia, and we're going to talk about the book. And so Paul's got some stuff here to help us out to orient us with the book.
Well, the foreword on the back of the book was done by Bishop Athanasius Schneider. So I figured I'd read that first paragraph. He said, at the threshold of the 20th century, a century of unheard militant atheism and anti-human monstrous political regimes, Pope Leo XIII gave to the Church the famous prayer to St. Michael the Archangel, which he ordered to be recited worldwide by each priest and the faithful after non-chanted Mass. The same Pope gave a very powerful prayer of a general exorcism against the infestation of Satan and the evil spirits. Pope Leo XIII himself recited this exorcism several times during the day.
Yes, indeed he did. And we know he did that because there was a cardinal, more on him later, that talked about this. And so there's a very famous vision. Like we're going to jump right into this. And there's a very famous story about a vision that Pope Leo XIII was said to have had that led to the prayer to St. Michael. Most Catholics know the prayer. It goes, St. Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle. Be our safeguard against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray. And do thou, O Prince of the heavenly host, by the power of God, thrust into hell Satan and all the evil spirits who prowl throughout the world, seeking the ruin of souls. Amen. It used to be part of a series of prayers that were said after low mass, or as Bishop Schneider put it, the non-chanted mass, and it fell into disuse a little bit after Vatican II, and there's some questions about that. Maybe we'll get into a little bit about that today. But the real question is, did Leo really have a vision? And I want to tell you guys a little bit about the history of the book and how it came to be, because it kind of sets us into what we're going to be talking about here more deeply. The book was born in Summerville, South Carolina. It's just north of Charleston. I was visiting with a friend, and he brought another friend along with him. And the three of us were talking at a restaurant today called Capamana. And then we were also later on and kind of continuing the conversation in a car. And the gentleman was he was a very interesting individual, and he made some comments that were not correct about the St. Michael prayer and the history. And I knew that they weren't correct because about a few years prior, I had done some initial research into the history of this prayer by following up on some of the leads and the footnotes that you would see on various internet websites. And so I said, you know what? I am going to write about this. I'm going to research this and get to the bottom of this. What really happened? Did Leo really have a vision? So from May of 2012 until about mid to late November of 2015, I set myself precisely to do just that. I was able to go and look at foreign language resources between Spanish, Italian, German. I think there was even Dutch, I think at one point, that I kind of looked into for some of the research. And ultimately, what I concluded was that there is some veracity to the story that Leo had a vision, but it's not quite what we understood it to be. Well, what it is said to be largely on the internet. So what originally is said on the internet? What was the big deal here? Like what is Leo supposedly to have seen? Well, there's different versions and variations that you'll find on the internet about it. But the general nuts and bolts go that one day Pope Leo was celebrating Mass or talking to people, and all of a sudden he collapsed. Or he went dead quiet. He was looking around, all of a sudden look up and just looking off into space. And then he got up and he went into his private apartments, and people were going, Holy Father, are you okay? Okay. And he was just, like, do you need anything? His niente, niente, would just tell him for nothing. And then shortly after, he came out and with a piece of paper and ordered that this prayer was to be added to a series of prayers that were said after Mass called the Leonine prayers. And that was around roughly somewhere between 1884 and 1886. And shortly thereafter, that prayer started appearing in various publications, and it was added to those prayers that were said after Mass. But as time grew on, over the next few decades, there was like radio silence. Nobody was really talking about anything. Nothing was really in print until starting in about the 1930s, 1940s, people started talking about that prayer and saying, well, Leo had a vision. And supposedly the vision was he saw Jesus and Satan talking, and the devil was asking for 100 years to test the church. And Jesus said, you have the time, you have the power, do as you see fit. And so that's why we had all that terrible time in the 20th century with all those, all the two world wars, the Korean War, Vietnam War, et cetera, and all of this stuff with the church, that just the breakdown of faith and good morals, whole bunches of stuff that had happened. So a lot of people said, well, the proof was in the pudding. Look what happened, And I said, well, you can't really prove something after the fact. The proof is in the pudding is actually a logical fallacy. But having said that, I was like, we got to look more deeply into this. But it wasn't until the 1940s that it was a cardinal, our Cardinal Archbishop of Bologna, Cardinal Nasali. He wrote a letter for Lent in, I think it was 1946, and he told everybody, I knew Leo's private secretary, Monsignor Rinaldo Angeli, and Angeli told me and others that, in fact, Leo did have a vision. But it wasn't of a conversation. The cardinal said nothing about a conversation. All he said was it was a vision of demons coming upon Rome, and he used a cooking term, adensavano, it means like thickening. So if you're making a soup, you add stuff to make it thicker. That was the idea. So all these demons were thickening, literally translation, upon Rome. So they were like gathering, and they're like causing blackouts because you can't see anything from no light was getting through. So with that kind of imagery, you can kind of see that the faith and the light was getting occluded and darkness was reigning in a way. And then the cardinal also said that what he saw helped him to write that prayer, specifically the line that prowl throughout the world. In that one line is summarized a lot of what the cardinal said was what this vision was. And then the cardinal made some other remarks about another prayer that Pope Leo had composed. But that's all he said about the vision itself. And of course, being a cardinal and citing his source, that's a very powerful statement to make. It's like, okay, well, he's not only just telling us that Leo did have vision, but he's also naming his source. So that was one of the things that I did. I said, well, okay, well, now let's look up who was Monsignor Rinaldo Angeli. And there was actually an Italian scholar who wrote an article all about Angeli, and it made my life a lot easier because like, well, hey, look at that. It's already written down for me. Well, I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. What did he say in Italian? How can I translate this into English, and how can we introduce people to the good Monsignor? So I did that, and people got to know a little bit more about Angeli in the book. Was he a credible person? Was he, given over to extremes? Well, that's what we were able to get into a little bit in the book, was to just talk about Monsignor Angeli and a little bit of his character. So we knew the source, we had the information, and that made it very, very good for us to be able to do that. But that wasn't the end of the story. There were other people who knew other things as well. So, for instance, when I was doing my research, there was a website that put some information in Spanish, and they quoted a Jesuit, Father Theodore Baumann, who gave a Spanish, I think, translation of a very popular liturgical book by Father Joseph Jungmann. And in his translation, the Baumann put a note, a translator's note, and because in the original German book by Jungmann, he's commenting upon the history of the Leonine prayers, and there was a remark about this alleged story with the vision, and Father Baumann wrote his own note that says, well, actually, in fact, there was a consultor to the liturgical publisher, the Pushtet Publishing House, and Father Brehm, B-R-E-H-M. Father Brehm came back from Rome, where he had attended a meeting of the Congregation of Rites, which oversaw liturgical worship in those days, and this was in the 1920s, he said. And he said Father Francisco Brehm came back and told us what he had witnessed. And the cardinals were actually asking that question about the Leonine prayers, should they continue being said after Mass. And the reason why that was even being brought up was because the intention for those prayers was for the resolution of the difficulties between the Holy See and Rome after the fall of the Papal States in the 1870s. Well, that was now being resolved by the Lateran Treaty of 1929. And so if the intention was no longer valid because it was being resolved, should we abolish the prayers? Well, the Congregation of Rites was discussing this, and they were about ready to axe the prayers when, according to Baumann, who heard this from Brehm, he said, an ancien, A-N-C-I-E-N in Spanish, cardinal, an older cardinal, stood up and said, well, in fact, those prayers were inspired after a vision that Pope Leo had. and and it involved Freemasonry, and that's all Bauman wrote. And I'm like, oh man, what else is going on here? But that's what Bauman wrote. So they were in fact not abolished. Some recommendation must have gotten to the then Holy Father, which at that time was Pope Pius XI. And Pius XI renewed the prayers and said, yes, they are to be continued to be prayed, except instead of the intention is no longer to be for the prayers for the resolution of this problem between the Holy See and Italy. Now he said they are to be prayed for the conversion of Russia, which now has Fatima undertones. We're starting to get into a little bit of Fatima history. Now there's kind of an organic connection. Because at that time, communism was starting to rise. And around the time where this question was being discussed about whether or not to abolish these prayers, Our Lady appeared again to Sister Lucia, the last surviving seer of Fatima, and told her that the time had come where God requests the consecration of Russia to my Immaculate Heart. Unfortunately, Pius XI did not consecrate Russia in time, and so Russia, as Our Lady predicted, would spread her errors throughout the world, that atheistic communism. But we weren't entirely devoid of everything, because Pius XI did order those prayers to be recited for the conversion of Russia. So we get some interesting ties in there. And so for the next 30 or 40 years or so, the prayers were recited with that intention in mind. And then we had Vatican II, and one of its documents, the Sacrosanctum Concilium, wanted to simplify the liturgy. There was a clause in there about simplifying the liturgy. And after the council, or after that document was published, the organization that was responsible for the implementation of that document, the Concilium, headed by, or the secretary was Archbishop Annibale Bonini at the time, I believe. They decided that, well, part of the simplification is we need to, the Leonine prayers are to be suppressed. They're not part of the Mass, etc., etc. So in a document called Inter Ecumenici, I believe it was paragraph 48J, I think it was, or around that paragraph, it's very explicit. These prayers are to be suppressed. So people, by and large, stopped praying them. But individual people would still pray them. And among many of the extraordinary forum attendees, they still prayed that prayer after Mass every day, after the low Mass. And then there's just the prayer itself to St. Michael that people would pray in private devotion. One of the big ones that I've seen over the years is to pray it after the Rosary. So after the formal prayers of the Rosary, people would say, St. Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle, etc., etc. So that's a lot of the general history of the prayer itself. And we got Dr. Carr here, we got Paul Ciaccia. So that's a lot to kind of take in all at once, and it looks like Dr. Carr wants to weigh in on this topic.
Yes, Kevin, that is an impressive amount of research that you've been able to digest and lay out in front of us. So congratulations on that. That's an accomplishment in and of itself.
Well, thanks.
So I have a couple of quick questions. First of all, is it true that there are two different versions of a prayer, a longer version of the prayer and a shorter version?
Actually, it is not true that there are two. There's actually more than two, believe it or not.
That doesn't surprise me at all. So how many were there?
By my count, let's see. There was one. There was the original one that was said in the Leonine prayers. There was one in September of 1888 that made it into the Raccolta. Then there was a longer one after that one that appeared in May, I think, of 1890 that I call the 1890 Exorcismus prayer. And then that prayer was edited to be, it was truncated a little bit, and it was published under Leo's orders in 1902 in the official Rituale. So there was no less than four different ones. Yeah.
All right.
That enjoyed an organic connection through Leo's experience and what his wishes were. And technically, maybe you can also add a fifth one in there, because there's a powerful ritual that's used for blessing of water, for the Epiphany water. When you look at the text of that prayer for the blessing of the Epiphany water, it's almost like somebody copy-pasted from the longer St. Michael prayer. So technically there's a fifth one floating out there that nobody really talks too much about.
All right, and these different versions of the prayer share much of the same vocabulary or language, or they at least have the same intention?
The St. Michael, the original one actually is much, much shorter, and it was just a very simple prayer after Mass. The other ones were intended actually for exorcisms proper. the September 1888 version that made it into the Raccolta, that was for general use by anybody. So it didn't have all of the ritual, the exorcism ritual stuff proper that would be for priests and bishops. But a couple years later, Leo did in fact put that the proper exorcism one in the Acta Apostolic, Acta Sancti Sedis back then. And it was that, but that was for bishops, and priests could pray with the permission of their bishop. And that was the really souped up, but it wasn't an exorcism of persons. It was an exorcism of places, which at that time was kind of a novel thing. But exorcism of place, Leo's vision, as the Cardinal Nasale described it, of demons choking, in a sense, gathering en masse over the eternal city, Rome, the Eterna Città. You can kind of see the connection there. So Leo wanted to have proper protection against places, even from demons. But then what happened was there was a line in that 1890 version that really kind of drove the point home with that contention between the Pope and the King of Italy. And Leo entered into some secret backdoor negotiations with the King of Italy, the Kingdom of Italy and the King of. And it is said that one of the things that he decided to do was mitigate the wording of that, the intense wording of that prayer, the 1890 version, which led to that shorter version in 1902. Unfortunately, there arose a conspiracy theory surrounding it, saying that, it was people who did that behind Leo's back, and once he was dead, yada yada yada. But when you do that, it actually happened in 1902. Leo died in July of 1903, and it was done expressly on his orders. And in fact, one of the things that I did, Dr. Carr, was I was able to contact the Vatican Secret Archives, and I asked them about that stuff with the condensed, the truncated version of the prayer. And the Vatican archivist actually got back to me and said, "Yeah, we have the documents, and here's a scan." He actually scanned them for me, and it was from Cardinal Gotti, who had just come out from an audience with the Pope, and you got the handwritten notation, I think it was from the Cardinal, saying that Leo had approved this vision, and had approved this version of this new prayer, and everything. It was all legit. Everything was all in the up and up. Thank goodness for the power of email and being able to communicate to the Vatican Archives and have a way to pay them, because I had to pay them for their services.
I can imagine. Yeah, archivists don't work for nothing.
No,
they don't get paid enough as it is. They work on commission. Yeah, sure, we'll photocopy these 1,500 pages. All right, the second question I think will be much easier to answer, and this is probably a simple yes or no question. In the course of the mystical currents, shall we say, in the 20th century in the Catholic Church, has anybody ever recorded a locution, either from our Lord or the Blessed Mother, or maybe even from St. Michael himself, providing independent verification of the vision that Pope Leo is said to have had?
Nothing reputable that I know of. I do know that there are some people, like there was a Monsignor Arthur Calkins who wrote an article for The Wanderer, I believe, and he said that Leo's vision happened on October the 13th, 1884. Well, I got a copy of that article by Monsignor, and he doesn't tell his source. And everybody seems to take as gospel truth that the vision happened on October the 13th, 1884. Now, it is true that that date falls within the time frame that Leo's vision could have taken place, but there's no actual proof that it did. And so many people run with it on the internet, and they say it happened at that time, and they try to connect Fatima to that. And I'm like, no. The real connection to Fatima is the change in the intention of the prayers. That's what we know. That's we can substantiate. And unless somebody can provide a document from Leo himself or Monsignor Angeli or anybody else that knew about these things that says, well, in fact, yeah, that was October the 13th, 1884, then we can take that particular end of the claim seriously, because that's the anniversary of the miracle of the sun.
Right, and Monsignor Calkins did pass away a year or two ago.
He just died?
Yeah, relatively recently, yes.
Oh, I didn't know he was still alive.
Yes, he was at the
the
Mariological Society of America conference. Must have been 2 years ago now, and he died before the conference after that.
Yeah, you know what? I'm wondering if I have the right name. Paul, could I see the book?
Yeah.
I'm wondering if I have the right name now that I really sit and think about it. I'm sorry. It was Monsignor Durand. I'm sorry.
That's different.
I got my people mixed up. I am so sorry. Monsignor Durand wrote the article in the Wanderer. See, I get the book in my hand, and then all of a sudden it's like osmosis. It just jumps back into, it jumps back into my head.
Well, listen, this is totally forgivable. You're carrying so much information in your head.
I
If
don't know
something
about
else
that.
gets off track, I think that's a venial oversight.
I do apologize. It was Monsignor Durand, and he wrote an article in the Wanderer. I think it was around the 80s. I want to say 80s or 90s. But I did get a copy of it. I have it in my files, and it was incorporated. It was in one of the chapters and footnotes here in the book. I was about to look up the bibliography and say, wait a minute, I have a bibliography, or I thought I did.
Well, when did the church change its opinion after Vatican II that this is a valid prayer to use with exorcisms and everything else?
You mean the Exorcismus prayer from 1890, or
This-
the shortened version later on?
Whichever one we were. You said it was in Vatican II. It was stated.
Oh, that was the
that
St.
it was,
Michael prayer, the one
right,
that we used to
that's
say
what I'm
after
talking about, the
Mass.
St.
That was
Michael
that was the original and the shorter one, the one that most everybody knows
That's what I'm
nowadays.
talking about.
Yeah, that was 1964. Inter Ecumenici was the name of the document. I believe it was paragraph 48J, I think. But, you know, Paul, there's actually something very interesting about that. I later wrote an article that was published, I believe, in the Latin Mass magazine. And when you read that the Inter Ecumenici cited the authority of the Vatican's two liturgical document, Sacrosanctum there, and when you read the paragraph that it cited, it said the Mass, or the rites of the Mass, are to be simpliciter, simplified. However, when you read the history of the prayer, which is documented in my book, the Leonine prayers were never part of the Mass. They never were in the Missal. They were also, they weren't just known as the Leonine prayers, but they were known as the orationes post missam, the prayers after Mass. Okay. So when the concilium cited that particular paragraph about simplifying the rites of the Mass, and cited that in defense of removing the Leonine prayers, that actually didn't apply. If you look at it from a strict legal canonical perspective, well, the Vatican documents didn't say to get rid of that. You can't. It's like, well, and then you can argue, well, it's the spirit of it. It's like, well, isn't that the same thing as the spirit of Vatican II? Right. And that we seem to have lost an awful lot in throwing out the baby with bathwater with that particular argument. However, to be fair, Pope Paul VI still signed off on Inter Ecumenici. So regardless of whether or not the citation itself was proper, I'll say, the Holy Father did approve it, and so it was legal. Like the suppression of the Leonine prayers was legal, and it had to be done. Again, I would have respectfully said, Your Holiness, do you think we need to double check this one before we just before you pencil whip this one?
So the biggest, I guess, misconception surrounding the St. Michael prayer is how or when the vision happened. Is that the biggest misconception in the church regarding this?
Really, the biggest misconception, as I understand it, is what the vision actually was.
Okay.
The when is maybe a second or third in line issue, but the big issue is what was it? And it's important.
And what's the most common thing people believe about the vision?
That the devil was given 100 years to test the church, to tempt the church, and to do harm to the church. And your question is actually really, really important, because this is touching upon the very heart of why we talk about this and why I wrote the book. The purpose of prophecy in Catholic theology is to give hope to people. Prophecy being the communication or the revealing of the will of God in present moment, in a given human event or human epoch of history here. Well, people draw that hope. And so when they are believing that somehow we only have the clock is ticking, there's only 100 years, and then after that we're going to have this golden age of, moonlight and roses and unicorns and rainbows, it's one of those things where it's false hope. And then when some people had said, well, the 20th century is 1901 to 2001. And so people were waiting for 2001 to happen. And then when it happens, the 100 years is over. And then when 9/11 hit, people started going, oh my goodness, wait, this is continuing? And so people started moving the goalposts. And I still continue to see this goalpost today, where some people will say, well, no, it ties into the 100 years with Fatima and the request of Our Lady for the consecration. So this 100 years is going to go now to 1929. Well, what happens when 1929 comes and goes, and we still got things going on here? People keep putting their hope and their faith in the wrong things. And my book, it's the way I like to put it is like, if you guys remember Peanuts, Charlie Brown, he had the character of Linus and his blanket, and there was this one episode where he had the security, he had it taken away from him. He could not survive without that blanket. Well, that's very much what a lot of people have done here. Is some of these prophecies are like their security blankets, and you rip that away, and you see that visceralness underneath, and people are freaking out because they don't know what to do. Sure. It reveals a lack of faith. And I don't say this to judge anybody. I've made plenty of errors myself or misunderstood things, et cetera, et cetera. I'm just pointing out, folks, we need to rethink some of these things because you're putting your hope and your faith in the wrong things, bad information. And whether we like it or not, innocent or not, we have to answer at our judgment for this. So we have to take this thing seriously.
Quick, and Pope Leo never said that either, right? There's nothing on record that he said that was the vision.
Nothing on record other than what was communicated through his personal secretary to Cardinal Nasali. So it's like the telephone game. We don't have anything direct. Nothing is known, I should say, to have come direct from Leo himself. There's no handwritten document maybe there is something in Leo's archives. Unfortunately, I have not been able to find it just yet. I would love to, and that's actually what would make the third edition of this book even better. Is actually we found the document from Leo, and a bunch of other stuff now could really I could rewrite half the book practically if I just had something from Leo himself. But
wouldn't you think that he would have made sure that he would have, if we were supposed to know that, he would have written that down and made sure that got out to the public, or at least the Catholics?
He could have done that, yeah. But the fact that nothing ever did tells me that Leo probably wanted it to be kept hush-hush. There's a big tradition about popes and visions. Popes are the interpreters, the primary interpreters of divine revelation. And so if a pope is looking like he's constantly engaging in private revelations and stuff, it can look to be imbalanced. And that doesn't go very well with the image that the papacy tries to project of itself. And so even if a pope is favored with a private revelation, they're usually very careful, very cautious, probably even circumspect about it. One of the examples of this is the Sacred Heart devotion. There was, in fact, a mystic living that had written during Leo's time about that particular devotion, some of the revelations and promises and such about it. And Leo also, he had consecrated, he had done some stuff with the Sacred Heart, and we know now historically that there was some connection with this particular mystic, but he framed it all in terms of public or divine revelation as a part of the imagery of the papacy. So he didn't want to start all these wild rumors, but the question is, did he leave something for somebody to find later on, for posterity's sake? And as of 2025, that information has not come to light just yet. So, it's a lot to take in, as Dr. Carr noted. A lot of information rolling around in the head here. And I'm glad to have been able to write things down real quick, but write things down in the book. And it's in the book Pope Leo XIII and the Prayer to St. Michael. It's in the second edition, and if anybody's interested, you probably want to get a copy fast because there's only about 300 or so copies that are available left. However, there is a Kindle edition, so if you're into Kindle, that doesn't run out. But if you want the hard copies, it is a hardcover. It's $18 from Preserving Christian Publications, pcpbooks.org, pcpbooks.org. And like I said, you got to get them fast because there's only about 300 left. Everything's all there. It's in English translation. You can, if you're a glutton for punishment like me, plenty of footnotes with texts, etc. All kinds of good stuff waiting for everybody. And the whole history of these prayers, what happened, what do they say, what can we learn just from even, third or second sourced facts about what Leo's vision was. It's all here. And also please visit me on the web, kevinsymonds.com, KevinSymonds.com. And Paul or Dr. Carr, if you guys want to say anything.
No, it was been a pleasure.
Yes, very good. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, guys. And to all you out there listening, please pick up the book and enjoy and have good times out there. And remember to pray and pray for us.